To Kill a Mockingbird, chapters 6 to 9. So, for this section, you see a lot of progression in terms of Scout and Jem. Don't forget, like I said, each chapter is kind of a mini version of an important event. And we're working our way up to the trial, which is going to cover a large section of the book. So, in chapter 6, we see that Jem starts to grow up. Scout starts to face a lot of issues with gender roles because currently Atticus does not enforce those. He allows her to run around in overalls, allows her to have a lot more freedom than she would. Keep in mind that Scout's mother has died, which is one of the reasons that occurs. In chapter 7, we learn that Scout turns 7, and you're going to see that she continues to age along with Jem throughout the book. So these children are growing up physically, but they're also growing up emotionally and mentally throughout the novel, especially after the trial. In chapter 8, Mrs. Radley dies. This is important because Boo Radley is a key figure, and he is left alone with his father in the house. We also see that Mrs. Maudie's house burns down. In chapter 9, this is where all of the information starts to become really important. To be honest, from chapters 9 until the end of the book, that's the main chunk. A lot of the chapters before chapter 9 are mostly exposition, giving you information on the family, the kids, where they are, establishing how innocent and naive they are, how they think their world is perfect, that nothing bad can happen. And they slowly start to lose their innocence and gain experience as the chapters unfold. So character progression, I wanted you to start thinking about Jem because he is quite different at the beginning, especially in chapter 5. We saw that he kind of like railed against his father, was, kind of threw a little mini temper tantrum when his father wasn't around, saying, "Oh, I don't want to be like you." And he starts to change and develop. He also starts to change how he feels about the people in the town, how he feels about Boo Radley, and he starts to have more mature reactions, whereas Scout matures but at a slower rate, but she's 4 years younger than her brother. So where he starts out quite childish, naive, but he is starting to grow up. There's that one quote where he starts to recognize how his father sees him and treats him with a lot of respect. Atticus ain't ever whipped me since I can remember. I want to keep it that way. So he goes out of his way to stay out of trouble, despite losing his pants as they were spying on Boo Radley and getting his pants caught in the fence. So he goes back to get them, which is quite brave considering that Mr. Radley has a gun. And he does that because he wants Atticus to continue to respect and trust him. Scout also recognizes the change in her brother. She says, "It was then, I suppose, that Jem and I first began to part company. Sometimes I did not understand him. This is beyond me." This is also an example of a more mature, authorial voice. And this is because the novel is narrated by a mature adult Scout. And she is remembering her past. And as she's remembering her past, she sometimes comes in and makes little comments. And this is actually seen in chapter 1. And I know I told you not to read chapter 1 until the end, but I'm going to point this out. "When he was nearly 13, my brother Jem got his arm badly broken at the elbow. When it healed, and Jem's fears of never being able to play football were assuaged, he was seldom self-conscious about his injury. His left arm was somewhat shorter than his right when he stood or walked. The back of his hand was at right angles to his body, his thumb parallel to his thigh. He couldn't have cared less so long as he could pass and punt. When enough years had gone by to enable us to look back on them, we sometimes discussed the events leading up to his accident. I maintain that the Ewells started it all, but Jim, who was 4 years my senior, said it started long before that. He said it began the summer Dill came to us, when Dill first gave us the idea of making Boo Radley come out." And that first little section really establishes it because that's what we saw in chapter 2. It started with Dill coming to them and then being obsessed with Boo Radley, really interested in him and his life, especially the fact that there's a lot of superstition. And so that's where they started. And the Ewells, remember, we did become introduced to those in chapter 2 and 3. There was the family that was there living in extreme poverty. They're seen as white trash, which is a stereotype by the other members of the town. They live in the dump, reinforcing that white trash idea, and that the children kind of live in chaos and anarchy. So that is, again, that narrator that is coming through with that mature voice. Scout recognizes that Jem is growing up, and she, being younger, stays a little bit more naive. She grows up a little bit slower. So the theme of growing up is throughout these chapters, especially for Jem. Which she mentions one moment after they realize that the presents from the tree are gone and the tree has been filled with cement and that they cannot be friends with Boo Radley. When we went in the house, I saw he'd been crying, but I thought it odd I had not heard him. This is, again, that idea of growing up. The idea of Jem is crying more like an adult, the silent crying that you do alone. And if you know what I'm talking about, then you too have grown up and are more mature than you used to, right? When you think about it, little children cry really loudly and for attention. They want to be comforted. We, as teenagers and adults, tend to cry alone by ourselves and kind of seek isolation. So that's an example here of Jem seeking that. Scout and Jem also learn about Atticus's work. They're very protective of their father, and we see that in chapter 11 and 12 and 10. And Atticus makes a comment at the end of chapter 9. Why some people go stark raving mad when anything with a Negro comes up is something I don't pretend to understand. And that's really important because we're also going to see some symbolism in chapter 10 about people going stark raving mad. Something happens with men. And they're using mad here as a sense of crazy. So some symbols and motifs. Okay, we have the Radley house. It symbolizes that mystery, that idea of being locked up. It is the source of superstitions and the children's obsession with Boo Radley. The Radley tree we already looked at in chapter 5 and 4, that idea of growth and life, and it represents that growing friendship between Scout, Jem, and Boo. When Mr. Radley fills the tree with cement, there's a quote, "The tree is dying, you plug them with cement when they're sick." And yet we know that is a lie because Atticus had said earlier that the tree was perfectly fine. Mr. Radley does this to kill the friendship between Boo and the children. He doesn't want Boo to have any contact with the outside world. Presents, we talked about some of these, but there's a ball of gray twine, chewing gum, tarnished metal, a pocket watch with a chain and aluminum knife. It kind of represents that idea that time has stopped for Boo. And 2 small images carved in soap, a boy and a girl, which represents what Boo sees and that desire to be part of the world. All of these represent friendship. In chapter 8, Miss Maudie's house burns down. Fire can represent 2 things symbolically, either destruction, which is the house burning down, and rebirth, which is Miss Maudie's take on it. She sees this as a new opportunity. She's not upset. She says, "Grieving child, why I hated that old cow barn." Boo himself is represented as a ghost, that childlike innocence, that idea of that time has stopped for him. It would be better for you to view him as a child mentally, because that's more of where his description is going. They've never kind of moved, he's never moved beyond that, even though he is an adult. Mentally, he's the same age as a child, really. 2 other ones, pants. They are returned stitched up. It is strongly inferred that Boo Radley stitched them up. The fact that they're uneven, again, is a symbol of friendship, right? Being stitched up. And there's a blanket that appears around Scout's shoulders in chapter 8 when she's standing by the fire. That represents comfort. Again, it's strongly inferred implicitly that it was Boo who put the blanket on her. And that's also a good moment. Like, Atticus does treat his children as adults for a lot of it, but when he says, "Come on, baby, get up," he does treat her like a child, and he is that father figure. He's very gentle because something is wrong. So there's a couple of key themes in these chapters. So innocence, Boo for one, the idea that he thought he could make friends, and Scout, when she hears Atticus talking about the problems with the upcoming trial in chapter 9, and the idea that Atticus explains that he's going to be defending an African-American man because it is right, but that he will lose this trial due to the inherent prejudice of society. She says, "It was not until many years later that I realized he wanted me to hear every word." And that's the end of chapter 9. Again, we see that authorial voice of the adult scout coming through. But that is important because he does kind of want the children to realize that the trial is going to create a lot of problems. Freedom. If I didn't do it, I couldn't hold my head up in town. I couldn't represent this country. Simply because we were licked 100 years before we started, there's no reason for us not to try to win. Both of those quotes are said by Atticus, and it's about his fight for freedom and for equality of African-American individuals within the town. He's trying to explain to Scout and Jem why he is going to represent the African-American Tom Robinson in the trial. And it's really interesting because he says, I wouldn't be able to tell you kids what to do. The idea that Atticus has a very strong sense of morals and what is right. He is a moral figure. He's quite godlike in that sense, is strongly represented. And this idea that you have to continue to fight, even though you have been beaten before you start, it's no reason not to try and fight, is a great quote. It comes back in chapter 11, the idea of what is bravery, what is courage. It's about that strength within an individual to continue to fight when it is challenging. Bravery is not something that occurs if it's easy. If it's easy for you to do something, that's not courage. It is only courage if you know that you've been beaten, but you try anyways. When you try to do something that is that challenge, that's that true sense of bravery. And we see a lot of Atticus's courage in chapters 9, 10. We see courage again with Mrs. Dubois and Atticus in chapter 11. Humanity. So again, in chapter 9, Atticus is trying to teach equality. Do all lawyers defend Negroes, Atticus? So again, she almost says the N-word there, but he has taught her not to. And that's what he's, again, reinforcing in his children, this sense that all people are equal, that everyone needs to be treated the same. And that's precisely why he ends up taking this case. Of course they do, Scout, is what Atticus's response is. Now, that's not true. Atticus is lying here, technically, but he says this because it's what he wishes was true and what he desires for a future, especially for his children. We do see a lot of subtle gender roles. It's a kind of underlying theme throughout. Even Atticus is not immune to falling into some gender stereotypes. She's critiqued on her gender by her brother, by Atticus at times, and by Aunt Alexandra, when Atticus kind of says, to his sister, "I do the best I can." He does feel that maybe Scout doesn't have quite enough of a woman influence, and that comes back when his sister moves in with them in chapter 13. Jem says, "I declare you're getting more like a girl every day." We also have Scout that beats up Cecil for saying the N-word lover about her father. That's what he says because Atticus is defending the man in court. She also, though, interestingly enough, decides to turn away from a fight at the end. And that's slowly starting to show she is doing that for her father, which is going to lead to her growing up. But she is at a slower pace than her brother. Blindness. And in this case, we're talking about the metaphorical blindness in terms of society. I don't know what keeps. So Atticus says, "It's different this time. We're fighting our friends." When he talks about what challenges they're going to face in the trial that's coming up, that's because racism permeates society. It deeply divides neighbors. It deeply divides individuals and continues to do so. And that is the problem, that some individuals are blind to that problem, saying it doesn't exist. And you could say that is accurate today as well, right? There are lots of individuals who will say, "No, this doesn't exist. Everything's fine. Everyone's perfectly equal." But we know that people are not perfectly equal, right? People have more money than others. People have more education than others. People have better looks than others or better opportunities. All those things represent the idea that society isn't equal and racism is still permeating our society. Friendship. So that is really between Boo and the children. We see it in the gifts, we see it in the trees, and we also see it when he comforts Scout with a blanket. And that is your 15-minute lesson on chapters 6 to 9.